Brethren, the presentation that I've taken from Solomon today is entitled The United Grand Lodge of England. The subtitle is Always Grand and Always United? We shall see. A brief history of the formation of the Premier and Ancient Grand Lodges and their unification in 1813, which led to the United Grand Lodge of England today. The beginnings. It all began at a meeting of Freemasons held at the Apple Tree Tavern in London in 1716. That meeting resolved to meet the following year on the 24th of June, which is St. John the Baptist's Day, to form a Grand Lodge of Freemasons. The meeting on the 24th of June 1717 took place at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern and was attended by representatives of the 4 London lodges, those meeting at the following taverns: the Goose and Gridiron, the Crown, the Apple Tree, and the Rummer and Grapes. In those days, lodges were often named after the place where they met, so it was not uncommon to change their names as they changed their venue. The Goose and Gridiron was in St. Paul's courtyard and originally known as the Mitre. It was a famous venue for live music and home to the company of musicians, so its sign featured a swan and a lyre. It was rebuilt after the Great Fire in 1666 and a new sign made. But the painter made such a poor job that his swan looked more like a goose and his lyre looked more like a gridiron. So the name, the Goose and Gridiron, stuck. Grand. At the meeting on the 24th of June 1717, Anthony Sayer was elected and then installed as the first Grand Master by the oldest Master Mason present. It was agreed that the Grand Lodge of England would meet quarterly on St. Michael's Day, also known as Michaelmas, which is the 29th of September, St. John the Evangelist's Day on the 27th of December, Lady Day or the Feast of the Annunciation on the 25th of March, and St. John the Baptist's Day on the 24th of June. It is interesting to note that the United Grand Lodge's quarterly meetings still occur in the same months today. Unfortunately, Sayer turned out to be an ineffective Grand Master, and little progress was made. Indeed, after serving his term as Grand Master, Sayer sought charity relief from his lodge several times and was appointed as paid tiler in 1734, often given as a means of supporting Masons in distress. He died in 1742. So initially, the Grand Lodge of England was not all that grand. However, the second Grand Master, George Payne, set about organising English Freemasonry with great enthusiasm and credited with introducing it to the English nobility. His successor as Grand Master, the Reverend Dr. John Theophilus Desaguliers, is most certainly worthy of mention. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society and a personal friend of Sir Isaac Newton. He is credited with reviving the office of steward to great effect, and with encouraging more noblemen to participate in the craft, paving the way for the second Duke of Montague to accept the office of Grand Master in 1721. United. In the years following the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, Grand Lodges were also formed in Scotland in 1736, in Ireland in 1725. Both generally adhered to the original precepts of Freemasonry, while the Grand Lodge of England and the London lodges slowly made changes to them. The most contentious of these changes among Irish and Scottish Freemasons were failing to celebrate St. John the Baptist's Day with special meetings, exchanging the signs and passwords for the first and second degrees. This was done to prevent non-Masons who had read exposures of Freemasonry from gaining access to lodges. Virtually ignoring the existence and importance of the Royal Arch. abbreviating the ritual, most notably by removing the catechisms, de-Christianizing the ritual by removing overtly Christian references and phrases, omitting to prepare candidates properly, ceasing the recital of the ancient charges, so-called austerity reforms to the ritual, e.g. no longer using swords, paring down the installation ceremony, and departing from ancient physical layout of the lodge. Scottish and Irish Masons visiting London also reported being made increasingly unwelcome at London lodges, partly because of their social background and partly because their loudly voiced criticism of English Freemasonry. These tensions came to a head on the 17th of July 1751, when 5 lodges met at the Turk's Head Tavern in London and formed the most ancient and honourable society of free and accepted Masons, with its own Grand Lodge of England, which became known as the Ancients' Grand Lodge, in contrast to the existing Grand Lodge, which became known as the Moderns' Grand Lodge. The two rival Grand Lodges coexisted, but never recognised each other. By the late 1790s, it was becoming apparent that English Freemasonry would be stronger if they could settle their differences and unite. This pressure was increased following the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799, which banned meetings of groups in secret that required members to take an obligation. The Duke of Atholl, representing the Ancients' Grand Lodge, and the Earl of Moira, representing the Moderns' Grand Lodge, jointly petitioned the Prime Minister, William Pitt, to exempt Freemasonry from the Act, given its law-abiding and charitable nature. This petition was successful, and Freemasonry was exempted, on condition that each lodge secretary provided a local clerk to the justices of the peace with a list of lodge members each year. Surprisingly, that requirement remained in place until the 1970s. From that joint success, momentum towards uniting the two Grand Lodges began to gather pace. But it was not until 1809 that direct and fruitful negotiations began, concluding on the 27th of December 1813 with the creation of the United Grand Lodge of England. That was not quite the end of splits in English Freemasonry. There was a Grand Lodge at Wigan from 1823 to 1866, but that's another story. The United Grand Lodge of England today. Today, UGLE's headquarters are at Freemasons Hall in Great Queen Street, London, an impressive Grade II listed Art Deco style building. Completed in 1933 to the designs of Henry Victor Ashley and F. Winton Newman, it is a memorial to the 3,225 English Freemasons who died on active service during the First World War. It occupies a plot of some 2¼ acres on the same site as the original Grand Lodge Hall, which opened in 1776. The Grand Lodge and the Royal Arch Grand Chapter, as well as several provincial Grand Lodges and the governing bodies of other Masonic orders, meet in the lavishly decorated Grand Temple, which seats 1,700 and has a splendid Wills pipe organ. There are another 23 lodge rooms, plus lodges of instruction, used by around 1,800 lodges that meet in the building. Behind the scenes, around 150 staff maintain and manage the building, as well as administering the Grand Lodge, Grand Chapter and 47 Masonic provinces, plus 29 overseas Masonic districts, with around 780 lodges. So in conclusion, yes, it would be fair to say that today the United Grand Lodge of England is definitely united and certainly grand. Now, brethren, that concludes the presentation, but I would just like to add one other thing, that the building in Great Queen Street also houses the Museum of Freemasonry, which is open to the general public and well worth a visit, an extremely interesting and enlightening experience. Thank you, brethren. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to being with you again in the future.